It was a night when the rain poured, as if the sky itself was shedding tears for what was to come. The rhythmic tapping of droplets on the windshield had lulled Alex Colón into a dangerous trance, his grip on the steering wheel loose, his mind miles away. In an instant, the serene patter of rain was replaced by the deafening screech of tires as his car lost control. The steering wheel jerked violently from his hands, and the once firm road became an unpredictable torrent of slick water beneath him. His heart lurched into his throat as the car hydroplaned, swerving like a toy caught in the whims of a vengeful storm. Time slowed to a cruel crawl. Alex saw headlights, blinding, angry headlights, belonging to an oncoming truck growing larger and larger, closer and closer. There was no time to scream, no time to pray, just the cold realization that this was the end. The truck missed him by a hair's breadth, a near collision that would have obliterated him in an instant. But fate wasn't done playing its games. The car, spinning in what felt like slow motion, hit the guardrail. Alex felt the weightlessness as the car was sent airborne. His body was tossed like a rag doll. Each flip was accompanied by the nauseating sound of metal grinding against pavement, the windows shattering, and the sickening thud of his body hitting the interior. Then, silence. The car landed upside down, its roof crushed against the road like a fallen monument. Glass littered the asphalt, shimmering under the rain like distant stars. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain, a gentle mocking rhythm against the twisted remains of the vehicle. Alex was still, too still. The paramedics arrived, their boots splashing through the growing puddles, the lights of the ambulance casting long shadows across the scene. They pried open the wreckage, their faces grim, shaking their heads as they checked for any sign of life. There was none. Alex's body, limp and broken, was still as stone. Inside his mind, Alex felt something else, a pull, a coldness. The weightlessness returned, but this time it wasn't the car spinning. It was him, his soul, his essence, slipping away from the body that could no longer hold it. He drifted into a darkness that wasn't empty, but full of presence. A figure stood before him, cloaked in shadow, but unmistakable. Death. It didn't speak, but Alex felt its intentions, the finality. The cold embrace that he had evaded for so long had come to claim him. He stared into the hollow depths of death's gaze, and terror seized his heart. He was not ready. Panic surged through him, a raw, primal fear, and with it a defiant will. He wasn't going to die. Not now. Not here. With all the strength he could muster, Alex willed himself back, away from death's reach. He fought against the pull of the void, clawing his way back to the broken body that lay mangled in the wreck. A flicker of light, a desperate surge of life, and suddenly he was breathing again. The paramedics froze, their shock palpable. One of them had been seconds away from zipping the body bag when Alex's chest heaved, sucking in a raspy breath. His eyes fluttered open, wide with confusion, terror still fresh in his veins. A roaring tide of pain flooded every fiber of his being. The rain continued its steady beat, indifferent to the miracle or curse that had just occurred. Death lingered in the shadows, watching, angered, cheated. Alex had defied it not by accident but by sheer force of will. A game had begun, and death would not forget. The fear of death had rooted itself in Alex's bones, a quiet, insidious presence that haunted his waking moments. It reminded him of the accident, the cold, the weightlessness, the stare of death itself. Yet despite the fear, or perhaps because of it, he found himself drawn toward a solution. A new surgery, expensive and coveted, had emerged like a golden promise from an advancing world. It was a miracle of modern science, a procedure that would halt the slow decay of aging and grant humans more time to live, to conquer, to delay the inevitable. But like all miracles, it came with a price. The operation had a 50% death rate, a coin flip, life or death. Alex's mind swirled with the possibilities. He knew the risks, understood the danger. The surgery was his chance to reclaim control over his fear of death, to spit in the face of the thing that had haunted him since the accident. And so, he signed away his fears, placing his future in the hands of a gamble. The day of the surgery arrived. Cold, antiseptic air clung to the room, and the soft hum of machinery filled the sterile silence. Doctors and nurses moved with precision, their faces hidden behind masks, their voices hushed and distant. Alex lay on the operating table, his heart beating steadily, though his mind raced. The anesthesia crept through his veins like an unwelcome visitor, dragging him under. The lights above dimmed, the sounds grew faint, and soon there was nothing. Nothing until there was something. He felt the cold first, an all-encompassing, bone-deep chill that invaded every cell of his being. His body had been cooled to near death, his brain activity reduced to nothing but static. Time began to warp, seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours, or was it the reverse? He couldn't tell. The concept of time had lost its meaning. He drifted untethered, his consciousness slipping further away from the hospital, from the table, from his body. Then the darkness shifted. A familiar presence loomed. Death. It was there again, waiting as it had before in the suffocating silence of the void. His soul hovered just beyond the reach of its grasp. But something different emanated from death this time. It was something darker, a smoldering sense of irritation and offense, a cosmic annoyance that something so small, so human, could continue to elude it. Alex felt its weight bearing down on him, pressing the air from his lungs, freezing the blood in his veins. This was no mere encounter. This was an insult, an affront to the natural order. For Alex had not only cheated death once, but now he dared to undergo a surgery that so blatantly defied its very existence. The act was brazen, a mockery to death itself. Death stood there, its form more tangible than before, its presence heavier, more furious. The very nature of the procedure, the slowing age and extension of life, was a direct challenge, a declaration of war against the inevitable. To live was one thing, to desire more life, but to toy with the sacred balance between life and death was unforgivable. The cold of the void grew more intense. To laugh in the face of fate, to defy the very laws that governed existence, death did not take such defiance lightly. No, it would not forget or forgive this slight. And yet once again, something pulled him back. A surge of life, a jolt, coursed through him, dragging him violently back into his body. The darkness receded, the presence of death dissipating like a storm broken by the sun's first rays. His eyes shot open, gasping, lungs filling with cold air as if they had forgotten how to breathe. The doctors shouted in disbelief, their hands scrambling to record the miracle. Alex, who had been dead for 30 minutes, had returned. The surgery was a success, his body revitalized, but the fear lingered. Death had been there again, patient and poised, only to watch him slip away once more. But Alex could feel it now, deeper than before, a growing rage within death itself. He had defied the inevitable twice, and twice was one time too many. This was no longer a simple game. He could feel death's irritation, its frustration. It would not let him escape so easily next time. Alex's stroke of unluckiness struck again. He had somehow found himself in the heart of his office building, burning down, as if death itself had orchestrated this moment, testing him, or perhaps simply waiting to claim what it was owed. The air was thick with smoke, suffocating and blinding, each breath a desperate gasp for oxygen. Alex's lungs burned as he stumbled through the hallway, his vision blurred by the flames that danced like malicious specters, devouring everything in their path. The heat pressed against his skin, an unbearable weight that pushed him toward the brink of collapse. Walls cracked and crumbled around him, wood splintering under the assault of the fire, turning the building into a cage with no exit. Panic surged through his veins, not the cold, icy fear that gripped him in the past, but a burning urgency to escape, to survive. He'd been through near-death experiences before, and each time he'd clawed his way back. This time, though, there was no escape in sight. The flames cornered him like a predator, cutting off his path, trapping him in a prison of blistering heat and choking ash. His legs gave out. His body hit the floor, limp and defeated. His breaths came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one more strained than the last. He could feel it, death creeping closer. His consciousness wavered, the world dimming around the edges. And then, darkness. He didn't fight it this time, didn't claw his way back with the desperation that had fueled him before. No, this time he surrendered. He let the darkness claim him. There was no strength left to defy death. Not in this moment. He was certain that this was it, the end. But the end didn't come. This time, death refused to be cheated. It watched as Alex's body falter as the fire encased him in its merciless grip. But where the flames should have sealed his fate, death made a decision. It wouldn't take him now. No, not yet. There was a far greater plan unfolding, one that required patience, not haste. Death had now planned the endgame, and each escape, each breath Alex stole back, only tightened the invisible noose around him. With a silent, unseen gesture, death intervened, pulling Alex's unconscious form from the jaws of the inferno. Alex's debt to death grew heavier. There was a strange, cold embrace, not the suffocating heat of the fire, but a coolness, like a gentle breeze cutting through the inferno. Alex realized he wasn't burning, he wasn't suffocating. He was somewhere else. His eyes blinked open to the dim glow of streetlights. The sound of crackling flames was distant now, no longer consuming him. He was outside, lying on the ground, his body untouched by the fire that had threatened to consume him only moments ago. Confusion hit him like a wave, crashing through the fog of his fading fear. How? How had he escaped? There was no way out, no path through the inferno, and yet here he was, alive. Breathing. He pushed himself up on shaky legs, his mind reeling, struggling to piece together what had happened. His memory was a blur. Heat, smoke, and then darkness. But now, here outside the burning building, something was missing. Something vital, something he had come to expect. Death. It hadn't come for him, or rather, it had come, but it hadn't taken him. In the pit of his stomach, a sinking realization set in. Death had been there, watching, as always. But this time, it had made a choice not to take him. A deep chill washed over him, colder than the flames had been hot. Why? Why had death spared him? It wasn't luck. No, he knew better than to think that. This was deliberate, but the question gnawed at him. Was death losing its power? Was it retreating? Or had he somehow become stronger? Was he now beyond death's reach? The thought flickered in his mind, hesitant at first, but then growing stronger. Perhaps he was stronger. Perhaps he had defied death so many times that he could no longer be claimed. The fear that had once consumed him began to shift, to mutate into something darker, more dangerous, arrogance. A whisper in the back of his mind told him that maybe, just maybe, he was becoming untouchable. But there was still that lingering doubt, gnawing at him even as the arrogance took root. Death had aided him this time. It didn't make sense. Death didn't simply spare lives, not without reason, not without a purpose. But what was that purpose? Whatever the reason, one thing was certain: he had survived again. And with each survival, with each escape, his fear of death lessened. In its place grew a dangerous confidence, a sense of invincibility. Death had waited for this moment, the slow erosion of his fear replaced with arrogance and the foolish belief that he could outrun the inevitable. How amusing, Death thought, how fragile humans were in their defiance, unaware of the strings being pulled around them. There was no need to rush. The path had been set, and soon Alex would realize that every moment he believed himself beyond death's reach was simply a step toward a fate far worse than the one he had feared. This wasn't mercy. This was preparation. Death would have him one way or another, so Death let him live and waited, as it was not yet done. Alex, intoxicated with arrogance, decided to test his false sense of invincibility against an unstoppable force. Death, pleased with the dangerous pace to which his conceit grew, welcomed Alex's challenge. A storm raged overhead, a fierce symphony of nature's fury that crackled and boomed across the sky. Thunder rolled through the clouds like an ancient beast awakening, while jagged streaks of lightning carved their way across the heavens, illuminating the darkened world in brief flashes of blinding light. The rain came down in sheets, drenching the earth, a relentless downpour that blurred the landscape into a smear of shadow and water. Alex stood in the middle of it all, laughing. His voice was lost in the roar of the storm, but the laughter, wild, unhinged and reckless, echoed in his mind. He spread his arms wide, feeling the icy rain soak through his clothes, cold needles against his skin. The storm was alive around him, a force that could shatter mountains, uproot trees, end lives in an instant. And yet, here he was, standing in the eye of it, daring it to come for him. This was no longer fear. This was something else, a game, a taunt, a challenge. He had tasted death too many times now to be afraid of it. What was there to fear when each time he had slipped from its grasp? It had become almost laughable the way death seemed to chase him, only for him to outmaneuver it at the last second. A car accident, a near-fatal surgery, a fire that should have consumed him. Each time death had reached for him, and each time he had walked away. But this was different. The storm felt personal, as if it had been summoned for him, a force of nature answering some unspoken call. He could feel the tension in the air, the electric charge that danced along his skin, the rumble of thunder that vibrated in his bones. His heart raced, not with fear, but with exhilaration. He wasn't running from death this time. No, he was standing in its path, inviting it to come for him. "Come on!" he shouted into the sky, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Is this all you've got?" He laughed again, louder, the madness creeping into his tone as he looked up at the swirling clouds above. Lightning flashed, so close that he could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He could almost hear the storm's answer in the wind, a low growl that seemed to mock his bravado. "Strike me down, I dare you!" He was goading it now, drunk on the thrill of defiance, daring death itself to meet him on the field of battle. His fists clenched, his chest heaved with adrenaline, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, waiting for the moment when the storm would finally answer his challenge. And then it did. The bolt came with a ferocity he had never felt before, an explosion of light and sound that tore through the sky and slammed into him with the force of a god's fury. For a split second there was nothing but white-hot pain, his body rigid as the electricity coursed through him. Time seemed to stop, his mind suspended in the agony of the strike. The air around him crackled with energy, the ground beneath his feet scorched from the impact. And then it was gone. The storm continued its rampage above, but Alex stood still, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his body smoking from where the lightning had struck. He blinked, looking down at himself, half expecting to see charred remains where his flesh should be. But there was nothing, no burns, no scars, no sign that he had been hit by something that should have killed him. He was alive. He let out a shaky breath, his laughter gone now, replaced by a quiet, eerie silence. The rain continued to pour, the storm still howling around him, but in that moment, everything seemed unnaturally still. He could feel it, the presence of something watching him, something far older and far more patient than the storm. It wasn't the wind or the rain. No, this was something else entirely. Death was there, waiting. The realization crept over him like a shadow, cold and unsettling. He had felt it before, that lingering gaze in the aftermath of his near deaths. But this time, it felt different. This time, it wasn't just watching, it was amused. As if death itself had toyed with him, allowed him to survive, only to mock him with the knowledge that it could strike him down at any moment. He stood in the rain, his heart pounding in his chest, staring at the darkened sky above. The laughter had died on his lips, replaced by a strange, hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach. Why had it spared him again? Why had it let him live when it could have so easily claimed him? His mind raced with questions, but before he could latch onto any answers, the arrogance began to creep back in, like an old familiar friend. Maybe he was untouchable. Maybe he was beyond death's reach. After all, he was still standing, but the storm continued to rage, and somewhere in the distance, death smiled. It had time, and Alex was already playing right into its hands. The world had plunged into chaos, a war that raged across borders, drawing men and women into a conflict that promised no end. For many, the war was a burden, a tragic inevitability thrust upon them by the gears of history. But for Alex, it was something else entirely. To him, the war was an opportunity. The siren call of danger had been echoing in his ears for too long now, each escape from death leaving him hungrier for the next. He had missed the thrill of standing on the edge, of taunting death with reckless abandon, daring it to take him only to slip away at the last second. When the war broke out, he didn't hesitate. He volunteered immediately, not for patriotism, not for honor, but for the chance to face death again, to stare it in the eyes and defy it once more. He had become a fighter pilot. The skies were his new battleground, each mission a game of life and death played at high speeds. It was in the clouds where he felt truly alive, each dogfight a test of his supposed invincibility. And with every narrow escape, his confidence grew. That was why, on this day, as he found himself outnumbered, 3 enemy planes to his 1, he felt no fear. If anything, the odds excited him. His plane cut through the air like a knife, dodging gunfire and returning it with precision. The adrenaline surged through him, his hands steady on the controls. But in the chaos of the battle, one of the enemy planes got a lucky shot. He felt the sudden jolt, the sickening sound of metal tearing, and then the descent began. His plane was going down. Even as the ground rushed up to meet him, Alex's mind was calm. He had been here before, hurtling toward death, and he had walked away each time, the flames of the engines reflected in his eyes as the earth loomed closer. But he wasn't afraid, not anymore. The impact was brutal, the wreckage skidding across the battlefield in a trail of debris and smoke. Ally soldiers on the ground rushed to the scene, certain that no one could have survived such a crash. But then, through the haze of fire and twisted metal, Alex emerged, bloodied, bruised but alive. He barely had time to breathe before the next assault came. Him and the Ally soldiers marched forward until they found themselves behind enemy lines. They were ducking and weaving through the chaos, bullets whizzing past their heads as if the very air was trying to cut them down. Alex and his allies hunkered down in a nearby trench, pinned under heavy fire. They exchanged quick, breathless orders, but before any of them could react, a grenade landed at their feet, a ticking, death-wrapped gift sent by the enemy. Time slowed. Alex's eyes locked onto the grenade, its small, round body ticking away the seconds before detonation. The soldiers around him froze, eyes wide with terror, their bodies paralyzed by the certainty of death. But not Alex. For him, this was another challenge, another dare. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the same recklessness that had driven him into the storm, the same confidence that had carried him through every near-death experience. He knew without a doubt that death would not take him. Not here. Not now. So he moved. In a blur, Alex flung himself onto the grenade, his body covering it completely, his heart steady as he braced for the explosion. The soldiers around him cried out in horror, watching in disbelief as he made the ultimate sacrifice without hesitation. And then, nothing. The grenade didn't explode. A second passed, then another. The silence was deafening, the world holding its breath as Alex lifted his head, arrogance crossing his face. He looked down at the grenade, its deadly promise still intact but unfulfilled. For a moment, he thought it was a dud, some freak malfunction. But deep down, in the pit of his stomach, he knew better. This wasn't luck. This wasn't fate. This was death toying with him. He grabbed the grenade, his mind racing with the absurdity of it all, and threw it back toward the enemy. As if on cue, the grenade detonated at the feet of the enemy. His comrades watched in stunned silence, their faces a mix of awe and disbelief. Alex stood there, breathing hard, the smoke and ash settling around him, untouched by the carnage. He had done it again, survived, conquered death in a place where nothing but death existed. At the end of the war, his acts of bravery, his plane crash survival, his selfless dive onto the grenade, leading his allies to safety through miles of violence, earned him the Medal of Honor. He stood among the heroes draped in the flag, celebrated by a nation that saw him as something more than human. But even as the cheers of the crowd filled the air and the weight of the medal hung heavy around his neck, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had survived too many times, walked away from death too often. It wasn't luck, it wasn't skill, it was something else. And as he looked out over the sea of faces, the applause ringing in his ears, he couldn't help but only look for one familiar face: Death's. Why had death spared him again? Why had it let him live when every law of nature said he should be dead? He had no answer, but somewhere deep within the shadows of his mind, he could sense it, the lingering presence of death, watching, waiting. And this time, it wasn't amused. It was ready to push the endgame into motion. The years had passed in a blur. Alex had lived far longer than most, his slowed aging granted by the very surgery that once promised a taste of immortality. For decades, he had maneuvered through life with a sureness born from surviving too many near-death experiences. He believed, truly believed, that death had lost its grip on him. There was a clock always ticking. The surgery that had extended his life and halted his aging was running out, a quiet countdown that even his hubris couldn't ignore. Unfortunately, the surgery could only be performed once on an individual. He didn't fear it, though. How could he? He had outwitted death, beaten it at every turn. The thought of dying seemed absurd. He was invincible. Until he wasn't. It happened in the most ordinary of moments. No grand battle, no cataclysmic event, no heroics or final stand, just a random, sudden collapse. He had been sitting at his desk, reading when the world dimmed, his vision narrowing into a pinpoint of light, his heart clenched, a searing pain shooting through his chest, and then darkness. He hadn't expected it, not like this, not now. The unfamiliar sensation of cold washed over him, the creeping chill he hadn't felt in decades. It crawled up his spine, wrapping around him like a forgotten nightmare. The sensation of weightlessness returned, but this time it wasn't a fleeting moment. It was final. His body lay still, lifeless, and Alex drifted into the void. And there, waiting as it always had, was death. The figure stood before him, as calm and implacable as ever, but now its presence felt overwhelming, aggressive, suffocating. This was no longer the passive watcher from his past near-death experiences. This was the moment death had been waiting for, the moment it had orchestrated for so long. Alex's heart raced, or it would have if he still had a heartbeat. He stared at the figure, the cold certainty sinking into his bones. He was dead, truly dead, and for the first time in years, fear bloomed inside him, dark and all-consuming. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No, this can't be happening. I can't die. Not now." Death didn't speak, but its silence was more powerful than any words. It watched him with the same indifferent patience it always had, waiting for him to come to terms with the inevitable. But Alex wasn't ready. He would never be ready. "Please," he begged, the arrogance that had once shielded him crumbling into dust. "There must be something. I can't go. Not like this. Not yet." And then death moved. Slowly, deliberately, it extended a hand. Not as a weapon, but as an offer. A chance. Alex's mind raced, desperate, frantic. The fear that had once driven him was back, stronger than ever. He couldn't face the unknown, the endless void that lay beyond this moment. Death's gesture lingered, its meaning clear. There was an alternative, a way out. Death seemed to whisper, though no words were spoken. "Escape me once more, but you will pay the price." The fear clawed at Alex's insides, twisting his thoughts into frantic desperation. He didn't ask what the price was, he didn't care. Anything was better than dying. "I'll do it," he gasped, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'll take it. Whatever it is, I'll do anything. Just don't let me die." For a moment the void held its breath, and then death's cold hand touched his, sealing the bargain. There was no flash of light, no grand moment of revelation, just a chilling silence, the weight of eternity settling over him like a shroud. The fear ebbed, replaced by a strange, numbing calm. But something was wrong. The air didn't feel like air anymore. The ground beneath him was neither solid nor tangible. His body, the one he thought he had reclaimed, transfigured into a creature from a nightmare that would wake even the devil from his slumber. Unrecognizable, grotesque. Then slowly the truth began to unravel. He wasn't alive, nor was he dead. He was something else, something monstrous and insufferable, suspended between the worlds of the living and the dead. It hit him like a wave of ice, the deal, the price, the thing he had agreed to without hesitation. Death stood before him, no longer a distant figure but a reflection, a mirror. It spoke now, though the voice was soft, almost mocking. "You wanted to escape death, and now you have." His breath caught in his throat, panic surging through him again. What? What does this mean? Death's gaze remained cold, but there was a cruel satisfaction behind it. "You are mine now. You've become what you feared most. The one who ushers souls to their end, the one who collects them for eternity." The horror set in. He hadn't escaped death, he had become its servant. He had become death's new grim reaper. "No," Alex whispered, but the reality of it was undeniable. His existence was now tied to the very force he had spent his life evading. He had become death, the one who would gather souls to deliver them to the fate that haunted his entire life, walking between the worlds, neither alive nor dead, for the rest of time. In the distance, a soft sound echoed, pulling him from his thoughts. A name, a soul, ready to be collected. His first assignment. The ground shifted beneath him, and Alex felt the pull, an invisible force dragging him toward his first task. The fear returned, more palpable than it had ever been before. His hands trembled as he stepped forward, heavy with regret, dread filling every inch of his being. He had wanted to escape death, to live forever, but now he realized the terrible truth. there were fates worse than death. With his first step into his new role, Alex understood one thing above all else. Death had won. It always will.